Ah! We're doing some astronomy. Okay, so this is chapter 6. This guy right here is Galileo. Galileo. Isn't that some kind of song?
Yeah.
What's that from?
It's like, wait, no.
Galileo?
Maybe
I don't know.
Wait. Bohemian Rhapsody.
I didn't think they said Galileo.
not. Wait, that's actually not Galileo.
I don't think. I thought it's something else. A lot of scientists, if you polled 100 scientists and asked them to name the smartest guy that ever lived, or the best scientist that ever lived, most of them would say Newton, a lot of them would say Einstein, but a few of them would say Galileo. Galileo had some amazing insights and inventions, and I mean, he just did all kinds of stuff. And one thing he did was he didn't invent the telescope, but he kind of perfected it. And he was the first to use it to look at the stars. When the telescope was first invented, it was to look, at something far away, like on the horizon, like see what boat that is that's coming in over the horizon, that sort of thing. Galileo read about the telescope, and he invented his own. And the one that he invented was way better than anyone else had ever made before. So he had this great telescope, and he looked at the stars with it. So Galileo made a lot of discoveries. One of my favorite stories of Galileo. Here's how smart the guy. This will give you an idea of how smart the guy was. You with me, Amy? This is a cool story. So Galileo was sitting one day at a bar, and back then they had like cushions, and people were lying everywhere, drinking and eating and stuff. And so he's laying on a cushion, and he's been drinking a lot, and he's kind of staring at this lantern that's hanging from the ceiling. Y'all seem like you're reading and not listening to my story. It's a great story. I promise you'll like the story. So Galileo's kind of laying down, and he's watching this lantern just sway. Okay? And he takes his pulse, and he notices that it does one swing while he's counting his pulse. And it's just something he's doing to pass the time, right? And so a guy comes up, the guy that's running the bar, and he pulls the lantern off of its hook. The lanterns came on these hooks that it was hanging from. And he takes the lantern away to some other part of the bar where they need some light. And so he's just kind of sitting there in the dark waiting. And the reason, by the way, that the lantern was swaying was because the door was open and the wind was blowing in. So the guy comes back like 15 minutes later with the lantern again, but he's got it on another hook. That's the same length as the hook that he took it off of. And instead of removing that hook, he just takes that hook and he hangs it on the other hook that was already there to begin with. And the lantern starts swaying again with the breeze. And Galileo checks the swing of the lantern again with his pulse and figures out that because the pendulum now has a arm that is twice as long, that the swaying of the pendulum is twice as slow, or whatever the mathematics is there. And from that, he figures out the law of pendular motion. So he gets back, and before he kind of passes out from his drinking episode, he tells one of his assistants to write it down. This law of pendular motion that he had figured out at the bar. And his assistant does. He's got several assistants because he's a big scientist. He's rich. He's got tax money that's going to him to do all this. And he gets one of his assistants to write it down. Well, he falls asleep, and he wakes up the next day, and he forgets that he did it. Well, the assistant had misfiled the law of pendular motion that Galileo came up with. And so it was lost. And many, many years later, someone else comes up with the law of pendular motion and gets credit for it. And they find out later, when they finally find this paper that had been misfiled, that Galileo had actually come up with it many years earlier. And that's just one of the thousands of things that Galileo did in his lifetime. Is that not a cool story?
Well, how do they know the story of the bar? They just on the paper.
Because Galileo remembered when they found it how he had thought of it. Isn't that cool? And he called, oh yeah, I thought of that a long time ago. Now I remember. Yeah, Galileo was cool. So when he looked up at the stars with his telescope, this is one of the things he saw. That's Jupiter, right there. Y'all ever seen Jupiter through a telescope? We'll try and see that. Hopefully we can see that with our scope. We have a scope about the size of Galileo's. Actually, the one we have is a little bit better than the one he used. But, and you can see these 4 dots. Now, we won't be able to see it this good. This is actually from a better telescope than Galileo used. But Galileo, through his telescope, could see 4 spots, which are the biggest moons of Jupiter going around Jupiter. And they're called the Galilean moons because he was the first one to see them. And he noticed that those spots, he looked at Jupiter every night, and he noticed that those spots changed position. And as a matter of fact, when he drew this out in his notebook, he could see that the moon would move some every night. And he figured out from looking at Jupiter over a series of a couple weeks that these were moons of Jupiter and that they were going around Jupiter.
Like 4?
There's 4 Galilean moons. Those are the big ones that you can see. Jupiter has actually like 60 moons. There's only 4 that you can see with the small telescope.
Had they already known Jupiter was there?
They knew Jupiter was a planet,
But they didn't know about
but they didn't know about the moons. Now remember, at that time, there was kind of an argument whether the Copernicus was right about the heliocentric model, everything going around the sun, or was Ptolemy right about the Ptolemaic model, everything going around the Earth, which is the geocentric model. So there were 2 competing models, geocentric around the Earth and heliocentric everything going around the sun. Now, once again, do you remember who did the geocentric model? Who was the major guy behind that?
Aristotle? No.
Ptolemy, yeah. And Aristotle came up with it. Aristotle came up with it, and Ptolemy kind of perfected it. That's the geocentric model. The heliocentric model, who came up with it first?
Aristarchus.
Aristarchus came up with it first, and who perfected it?
No, Copernicus.
Copernicus. You'll need to know these, okay? This was on the quiz today. So, Copernicus said, no, everything goes around the sun. And the church was like, no, that's not right. You recant that. And Copernicus published that work kind of right before he died, so the church really couldn't do much about it. But that was out there, and the church was saying, no, it's geocentric. Everything goes around the sun. And this heliocentric model that Copernicus has put forth says no. Geocentric said everything goes around the earth. Heliocentric says no, everything goes around the sun. And the church didn't like this heliocentric, this is the Catholic Church, who, by the way, was very powerful back then. So powerful they had an army. So if you said the wrong thing, they could send soldiers to your house. So they had a lot of power, and the heliocentric went against the Catholic Church. And so this guy, Galileo, comes out about, 15, 20, 30 years after Copernicus. I'd have to look it up exactly when it was. But says, look through my telescope that I've just invented, or I've just perfected. Here we have moons going around Jupiter. Now, the church has said in their geocentric model, everything goes around the Earth. Nothing goes around Jupiter. Everything goes around the Earth. The Earth is at the center. So when they saw, when Galileo said, no, look, these are orbiting around Jupiter, not the Earth. Church didn't like that either. So they said, no. And he said, look at the telescope. They said, no. You have to recant what you're saying, or we're going to kill you. And thing about Galileo is he was kind of a famous dude, and it wasn't easy for the church to keep him quiet. People listened to him because he had done a lot of other things other than just talking about space. Here's another thing Galileo saw that proved heliocentric was right. Now, according to the geocentric model that Ptolemy perfected, everything goes around the Earth. Venus goes around the Earth, and even the Sun goes around the Earth in the geocentric model. Now, let me show you. Do you remember the epicycles?
Yeah.
How the planets do loops as they go around the Earth? Well, so if here's the Earth, Venus does an epicycle. It goes in a little loop with the Sun behind it. And so Galileo said, well, if Venus is doing these epicycles as it goes around the Earth, and the Sun is further out than Venus, according to the geocentric model, the Sun is further out than Venus, the way that Ptolemy had set up his geocentric model, the Sun is further out than Venus, so Venus is going around the Earth. Galileo said if you look at Venus through a telescope, you ought to see Venus has these phases. Has it's always a crescent phase or a new phase. But in the heliocentric model, if you look at Venus through a telescope, it should have these phases. Here's the Earth, there's the Sun. If everything goes around the Sun, you should be able to see a full Venus when Venus is on the other side of the Sun. Now, you can't see any phases with the naked eye, but through a telescope you can see the phases of Venus. So Galileo looked through his telescope and looked at Venus and saw all the phases of Venus, and indeed, a lot of the time he saw a full Venus and a gibbous Venus and a half Venus. Well, if the geocentric model was right, you would never see those full phases or gibbous phases or half phases. You would only see crescent phases and new phases. So once again, Galileo looked at the stars for a long, or at Venus for a long period of time, and then he said the orbit of Venus does have those full phases, so geocentrism is wrong. And the church said, no, you can't say that. Geocentrism is right. We're going to arrest you. And they couldn't kill him, but they arrested him and they put him on house arrest. And he couldn't leave his house for the last 20 years of his life. Yes?
What planets can you see from a telescope?
With the naked eye or with the telescope?
Both.
Okay, with the naked eye you can see Mercury, which is real hard to see because it's right near the sun. You can only see it when the sun goes down and it's just above the horizon. Venus, that's pretty easy to see. It'll be the brightest star in our sky. It's actually the planet Venus. Mars is pretty bright, kind of red looking, brighter than any star out there. Jupiter, also bright, further away than Mars, but big, so it's kind of bright. And Saturn also looks like a bright star.
Wow.
All these kind of look like stars in the sky. You'd think they were stars if you didn't know that they were planets. I'll take you out to the beach. I'll show them to you. Okay? You can't see anything else with the naked eye. Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, they're too far away to see with the naked eye.
But you can
If you have a
see them.
telescope, you can see them. Yeah. Galileo did not discover those planets, though, with his telescope. But he did make these observations. So Galileo, through the observations of Venus and through the idea that moons orbit Jupiter, he proved geocentrism wrong. And he showed that heliocentrism was correct. He gave the first evidence that Copernicus's theory was for sure right. And geocentrism was wrong. That's Ptolemy. He was eventually proven wrong. That's what he did a lot. He raised his finger. Here's another thing Galileo did. He looked at the phases of our moon, and he was the first one to understand that the moon had big craters and mountains on it. You can't see those craters very well with the naked eye, but you can see them really well with a telescope. We're going to look at the moon through a telescope one night. Looks cool.
Yeah.
How many have looked at the moon through a telescope? Just Amy? When did you do that?
My friend has a telescope.
Sweet. Isn't it cool?
Yeah.
Moon is very cool through a telescope. That's Pope John Paul II. Now, like I said, the Catholic Church arrested Galileo and imprisoned him, not in a prison, they put him under house arrest. They said the first thing you have to do, or we'll kill you, is you have to say that all your findings were false. And they made him do that publicly. So he stood out in front of the rest of the town and he said, I recant all my findings, everything I told you was a lie. With a spear in his back, he said that. And then they said, okay, you can never leave your house again. And so he spent the last 20 years or so of his life at his house. However, he had a big house. He had a lot of land. He had kind of a compound. He could still do his science work from there. He had his telescopes. He had people going and coming to take notes and things like that. He was still able to do a lot of good science, even though he was under house arrest.
It was like house arrest. Could he go outside and stuff?
He could go outside of his house, but he couldn't leave his property. So,
People pick up food for him?
yeah, he got food delivery. He was very rich. So, and people still sought his advice on things, science. So he did make discoveries, but he couldn't leave the country, couldn't visit, family that was elsewhere. And I think it was 1992, Pope John Paul came out and he apologized to Galileo, although it was 300 years too late, 359 years too late, I think it was. He said, you know what? Catholic Church was wrong, Galileo was right, and it was kind of a big deal. It was an official apology. Pope John Paul II was kind of a famous dude because he apologized for a lot of things that the Catholic Church had done in the past that weren't right. And that was one of the things he apologized for. There were other things. But, so he Galileo makes headlines again 359 years later when the Catholic Church admits that they were on the wrong there. So anyway, that's kind of the life of Galileo. He was a interesting dude, big in science. So here's, kids get confused. Geocentrism was first. That's everything going around the Earth. Heliocentrism was later. That's everything going around the sun. Copernicus came up with that. And then finally Galileo said, yes, Copernicus is right. Galileo provided proof that Copernicus was right. When Copernicus made his heliocentric theory, they didn't know that it was right. It explained things more simply than the geocentric with all that epicycles and stuff. But nobody knew which one was right. Galileo provided the first proof that heliocentrism was right. And now we know that. There's a lot of other types of proof. And we know that everything does go around the sun. Yay, Galileo. Are y'all good? I'm good too. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to read this section, read this chapter, and
Can I end the recording?
I have another quiz. You can